She's collaborated with groups around the world to design studies to better understand risk factors for health and performance problems in working dogs, horses and livestock. And she's going to tell us about the work of her centre today, working hard for dogs that work for us. Please join me in making Naomi very welcome.
I'd also like to thank the organisers, and in particular Mia, for the opportunity to come and talk to you today about some work that's happening at Massey University. What I'd like to talk to you to begin with, I'll introduce to you the centre, what we do, what our research is about. Talk to you a little bit about working farm dogs in New Zealand, because there are some differences between here and Australia, and then give you a little bit more information about 3 of our current research programs. So the Centre for Service and Working Dogs began in 2008. Myself and several clinicians, we were all sort of in this space of saying we want to do something about working dogs and service dogs. And so under sort of the drive of Andrew Worth, who is now the chair for the centre, it was established in 2008. Now in New Zealand, when we talk about working dogs, we're predominantly talking about farm dogs, and we are interested in those dogs as well as service dogs. And by that we're meaning the guide dogs, the police dogs, and as time has progressed it's also including the dogs that are used in quarantine as well as search and rescue dogs. There was a rather deliberate decision at the beginning to not include greyhounds in what we were wanting to do. We were sort of looking at the dogs that were being used sort of on farm and in particular roles. So the centre itself, through its board of directors, has a number of expertise. We have medicine specialists in the form of Kate Hill and Nick Cave and Boyd Jones. Nick also brings with him a wealth of expertise in dog nutrition. We have Andrew Worth, who is a surgeon, particularly orthopaedic surgery. Myself in epidemiology, study design and statistical advice. Animal behaviour, legislation and animal welfare, we don't have someone sitting on our board with those set of skills. We all are familiar with it, and we can draw on the expertise of Kevin Stafford and Rachel Stratton, some of you will know from Massey University. So if you came to Massey and wanted to see the centre, well, you wouldn't find a door. We're a virtual centre in that we've all stayed working within our individual organisations, so a number of them are still clinicians, researchers working in the small animal group. We also have on our board 3 practising veterinarians, 2 particularly in farm working dogs and 1 who's working with the police dogs in New Zealand. We do have a website which will be changing over the next couple of months, but you can see it here, and as you can see it's within Massey University. So what do we aim to do? Well, we're aiming to better the health of service and working dogs. We want to increase their longevity and the working life of these dogs, and we want to do this using scientific methods. So as many people here have spoken yesterday about evidence-based, we're wanting to create that evidence for which you can base your decisions. Who are our sponsors? We have sponsorship from Hills, Landcorp and Muriel Ancare are our main sponsors. Landcorp is a state-owned enterprise in New Zealand that also is New Zealand's biggest farmer. So the government owns large numbers of farms that they put in managers to run, and who will have so they've got their own dogs and their own organisation, but it is the state-owned enterprise, and it is partly coming in and running some of the more vulnerable in terms of environmental land, but they are also running very profitable business. Wairapa Vet Club has also given us money. The New Zealand sheep and beef cattle vets have given us money, and most recently, which hasn't made it here, our third-year vets do a charity every year, which is they do a naked calendar, and half the money goes to a cause and half goes to a weekend away somewhere for the group. So they've given us around about $3,000 this year. So in terms of working farm dogs in New Zealand, one of the big differences is it's pretty hilly, and what we have here is a shepherd, and it took me a while to realise that these, does this actually have a pointer? Yeah, are sheep, not rocks. And so this is really where the working dog comes into their own in New Zealand, is this really steep, either high country or hill country farms. And high altitude farms, as you can see in the background, you've got some snow, snow on the peaks. And so they're working in some pretty rugged and remote conditions. It's not to say that those on the flats don't use dogs, but this is really where they're coming into their own. We have two types of working dogs. They're not a registered breed as such. And the first I want to tell you about is the New Zealand Hunterway. It's a very large dog, 25 to 30 kgs, and we have two types. We have a very smooth coat, which has Doberman-like colouring, and we have a wiry coat, which is a beardy, or the name's just escaped me, the other name they'll use for the Hunterways. And just to show you how they work their stock, so we don't seem to have volume for some reason. So they're barking and moving that stock up the hill. So they get their name because they hunt away. They hunt the sheep away from them to move them through a gate or up a hill. The other sort of working dog is based on a border collie, but again, it's not sort of a registered breed. You can see here these are all heading dogs, but they all look very different. Okay, they're bred for the way in which they work stock, and they work in stock sort of perhaps the more traditional. When you think about seeing sheep being worked, they're going around the group. They tend to be a lighter weight dog, and just show you how these are. That sort of slinking down to the ground, coming around. And they get their name because they're, not that it was quite so visible in that clip, but we talk about them being heading dogs because they're sort of face on generally. Strong eye dog might be something else you'll hear a farmer talk about. There is also a third type of dog called a handy, so they can work as both heading or hunting, or as some farmers will tell you, they're just plain confused. So we have these sort of three types of working farm dogs. They are working stock in different ways. So you can imagine they're likely to get different injuries. You know, you've got a dog that's working close, such as the heading dog, more perhaps likely to be trampled by stock than a dog that's encouraging them to move away. So all of these things, understanding more about these dogs is what we're interested in doing. So in terms of the research, what I've taken here is just from our publications page. It's definitely not all of what we've done, but just to sort of take you through, as you would expect, having an orthopaedic surgeon involved, there's a real interest in measurement of inclination angles and motion of joints in German Shepherds and Greyhounds. I'm not quite sure what that's all about, but certainly Andrew's doing a lot of that to understand the forces that are happening in these dogs and to better use better surgical techniques to get these dogs back and working. We've also had, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about this, but Andrew's just had this paper published on the causes and losses of, from active duty in New Zealand police dogs. So the reason we're interested in doing this, as you heard from Steve yesterday, if you don't measure, you can't see if you're improving. So we're wanting to know when are they going, how are they going, because we want to know if we're improving over time. And it's also helping us to prioritise which problems we should be spending money on. It's no point doing it on someone's hobby horse if it only affects 2 or 3 dogs. We've also had a reasonable amount of work going on looking at leptospirosis. New Zealand has some of the highest levels in the developed world of leptospirosis. We did have a reduction going back about 20 years thanks to a campaign by rural women. We're now starting to see an increase both in meat workers and in farmers, and so there's a lot of interest in leptospirosis and a very active leptospirosis group at Massey University. And one of the things they've done with funding from the centre is to conduct a survey to find out how many dogs have actually been exposed to leptospirosis. And that was also driven in part because we had a number of dogs come in that were quite sick. They had positive antibodies to leptospirosis, and so people were thinking that's what was happening. They then went out on farm and they took blood from all the other animals on the dogs on the farm, and they were all positive. So the problem is trying to understand how it manifests in the dog. Again, we've got looking at some orthopaedic related things. We are doing a little bit around genetics, and we've also done a survey of dogs to find out what they come into veterinary clinics with, and this is a retrospective study, the last one. So if you want to see more about what the group's doing, go to the research and publications page. I want to focus in on 3 studies that we're working on. The first is a farmer survey, then we're looking at eye problems in sheepdogs and sources of losses for police dogs. So the reason I got into the farm survey was my husband got a working dog, and it was the first time I'd had experience with a working dog, and he told me all sorts of things. He said, well, we have to give it a 1-syllable name so that we can call it easily. So his name's Sam. Working dogs don't come in the house. Well, that hasn't really lasted as he's moved into semi-retirement and babysitting duties. So supposed to win an argument, I decided to go and find out what farmers were doing with their dogs. And we got a student who is Amy Jerome, and she collected a lot of data, and so we've got another master's student working on her data. So the aim of the study was to look at features, and I've put here in brackets the general working dog population. So I want to be really clear, there had been a lot of other work that had been gone looking at health problems of dogs that came to veterinary clinics, but if that's the case, you're going to see the most severe. You're also going to see perhaps in some ways the less severe, because some of these dogs have to come a very long way to the veterinary clinic, so they have to be stable enough to be transported. So we're not going to get all the health information from that. There was also a lot of other work going on looking at trial dogs, but just as we sort of talked about elite athletes yesterday and trying to take what goes in the next tier of athletes and applying it to elite athletes, we had the problem of not really thinking that the way trial dogs are maintained is probably not how all dogs in New Zealand on average are looked after. And we wanted to know about health problems and how those impacted on career longevity. For this talk, I'm really just going to focus in on the features of this population, and then come back and talk about the health problems and how they relate to career longevity in a talk later on today. So we did a cross-sectional study. We went in at one point of time. We asked them about all the dogs on your farm today, as well as any dog that had been on your farm in the last 12 months. And the reason we did that was that if you only ask about what's here today, any disease which kills them quickly or causes them to sell the dog, so a behavioural problem, for example, you won't get accurate data on that if you limit it to what's here today. You always underestimate those conditions. So we asked going back 12 months. We don't have access to a list of dogs. They are required to be registered, but not all working dogs are registered. So we thought, well, if we're after working dogs, we should go to the farms, because the working dogs will have to be on a farm. And we do have an available database which we maintain for exotic disease events, which we were able to access. And we decided that we would pick the Manawatu-Wanganui territorial land area for its proximity to the university. We wanted sheep and beef farms, and we wanted something that was, we wanted basically to exclude these lifestyle blocks. So what we have here on the right is a map of the area. You've got grey dots, which were all of those in the area that were eligible for inclusion. We randomly selected, and we tried to get it what we call spatially balanced, because things like how much high country you've got are going to be risk factors for injury, and we wanted to make sure that we were capturing all areas of the region. You can see from the square we did miss one region. That happens to be where Palmerston North City is. There is apparently a few eligible farms in that area, but we didn't get any from there. There's a little bit of a discrepancy. Was actually 119 farms. We got information, very detailed information, on approximately 1,200 dogs. We know that on average there were 7 dogs on these farms. We also know, though, that some farms had nearly 60 dogs. And we know that the number of dogs, unsurprisingly, went up as the land area went up, but it wasn't actually as closely correlated as you might think. Okay? We also know that the more hill country or high country you have, the more dogs you'll have. Over half were male, which kind of surprised me because I'm assuming that you get a rough 50-50 split in litters. And we found no evidence that females were being destroyed preferentially. So I'm not sure how we ended up with nearly 60% male in our survey. Unsurprisingly, but of concern, is that only 6% were neutered. Now, I understand that what farmers are doing is keeping these dogs, they're waiting to see if they have any potential and then breeding from them. So they're not sort of breeding on looks, they're breeding on ability. But you do end up with a lot of unwanted litters when you do this. In terms of what we saw, this is a picture taken by the student of sort of what a team of dogs might look like, and I think you'd be struggling to give any of them really a breed. So we sort of grouped them broadly on the instinct that they were expected to display. Now, we didn't actually ask them how that particular dog moved stock. We were looking at the literature and sort of making assumptions around that. So we have a hunt-away instinct, of which about 54 or 55% of dogs were hunt-aways, which was slightly different to the trialists. They tended to have more heading dogs than hunt-aways. We have these confused handies, but they're only making up a very small percentage. And this very strange group down here, I wouldn't have thought any of them would have been working dogs. I'm not quite sure what the poodle did, but I'm assured that it did move stock. I'll have to take their word for it. So I think it's important. We went in with some ideas, and I mean, okay, they are only 2% of the population, but you know, farmers weren't necessarily doing what I thought they would be doing. In terms of where were they when we visited, you know, to me it was quite reassuring that nearly just over 2/3 of these dogs were actually alive and on the farm the day we visited. We have a reasonable proportion that had been sold or given away, and then we have probably around 250 dogs that had died or were euthanized either by the owner or by the vet. There's some issues around, some people have issues around owner euthanasia. It is something I think we have to accept is there. In some cases it's actually very humane in that, you know, I mean, for example, we've had dogs run over by trucks on the farm. You're not going to get a dog with the broken spine to a vet to get it done quickly. So the humane thing, in my opinion, is to destroy them there, and that's what happens. But there is no doubt that there are a percentage of dogs that are being destroyed because they're not showing ability. So we focused in on these dogs that are alive at the time, and what we found was that approximately 2/3 of those were fully trained. And then the balance was split, mostly either in training or retired. Now it looks a very black and white categories there, and I think the really important thing though is it's not black or white, okay? Where a dog starts training is very hard to actually detect. Some owners will tell you when they're teaching the dog a sit or a stay or a return that they're training their dog, whereas others aren't telling you that their dog's in training until such time as it's working stock. So it's actually quite grey where they start. It's actually quite grey as to when do they go from being in work to being fully trained. And then that retirement isn't like, I suppose, some of the other dogs that are retired from, you know, you're no longer a police dog, you don't go to work anymore. Well, these dogs often are remaining on the farm and they are doing a couple of days' work here and there. So so we have this semi-retirement. So it's quite grey. And you might say, well, you're arguing about semantics there. Well, it's actually very important because if you want to look at career longevity, you've got to know when to start the clock and when to end the clock. If you want to do economic calculations, you have to know, when do you start the clock? When do you end the clock? What time are they doing less work? So it plays into a lot of what we're doing is what category are these dogs staying in and for how long are they in each category. In terms of age, not surprisingly, we had a very skewed distribution. On average, they were around sort of 4.5, 5 years of age, going out though as far as 19 years on farm. So we were seeing some quite old dogs that were being either in retirement or being used a couple of times a week. In terms of, we talked yesterday about what is our next research, what should we be doing these? The student also came back with a list of questions that the farmers asked. And I think it's really important that we understand what farmers want to know, because if we want to engage with them and we want to get them to come to things, it's probably useful to put it on topics that they're interested in. And sort of some trends in this is that they really are interested in how to improve training. So all of these in red relate to a training question. And the other thing that they're interested in is nutrition. Okay? And so I also think it's useful for those of you who are working in the veterinary curriculums around the country to realise that when your vets go out, your large animal vets go out, they're the ones that are going to be providing this information. Your sheep and beef vets actually need to be able to talk about working dogs, because for a lot of farmers that's the only expertise they bring onto farm to help them. We also looked at eyes in working dogs. This was funded by the centre, but we also had other sources of funding. Again, a master's student. And it started because of an earlier study that found approximately 40% of working dogs had some eye lesions. In comparison, only 6% of urban dogs did. When they did a little bit more histology on some of the dogs, they found that there was inflammation and some suggestion that it may be due to toxicaro migrating into the eyes. In terms of what the student or what the study aimed to do, was we wanted to find out really was the disease still present, because there'd been a lot of work on parasite control in farms over the years. If it was present, what was the prevalence, and to see if it was related to age, gender, and any of these issues. It was a convenience sample which has with it a raft of issues in terms of bias and quality of evidence, which I won't go into, but feel free to ask me about it in the break. A student went to the large circle indicates a practice area where they serviced, and he took working dogs from there, but he also went to the North Island sheep trials and picked up dogs from there. Naturally, we needed an owner who was willing to fill out a questionnaire, but we also, some trialists don't actually have their dogs on sheep and beef farms anymore. They're retired, but they've still got trial dogs. Won't really go through all of this in any detail, but the key points are that we had one person do all the eye exams. He was trained by an ophthalmologist, specialist ophthalmologist, in order to do that. And when he looked at the exams, if anything came up looking slightly abnormal, a picture was taken, and then the student, the specialist ophthalmologist, and a second vet, who was actually the vet that wrote the paper back in '87, looked at them and categorised them. And just to show you what they were looking at, here's a normal eye. We have some lesions here that were present. And so they were categorising the dog's eyes and looking at how prevalent eye problems were. So we found evidence of eye disease in 24% of the dogs. In 12% of dogs it was bilateral, so just over half had lesions in both eyes, and we had a range of, in terms of the various symptoms, and not being a vet I won't try and explain what all of these look like because I'll get very confused. But needless to say, we saw a diversity of problems with the lesions. They weren't all one type. In terms of risk factors, we did find that the lesions did go up with age, and the way we interpret this, if we look at the risk column, you'll see that in 4 to 7-year-olds, when we compare them to the young dogs, they're nearly 6 times, 5.84 times more likely to have a fundic lesion than those that were under 2 years of age. Now, before we go away and say age is a risk factor, let's think about the study design. And the key thing here is, because we went in at one point of time, any disease that doesn't kill you and you don't recover from will always increase in older people. So if you don't die and you don't recover and you're measuring at one point of time, older people will always have more of that disease. It's just a nature of any study that you go in at one point of time. So it is possible that age is a risk factor, but it may also just be an artefact of the design. So what did we find? Well, we found that the prevalence is lower. For any of you who've sort of got a stats or a study design sort of bent, when we put confidence intervals around that 24%, it is significantly different from 39%. So we are talking about a reduction. We're not sure if that is a real reduction because we were sampling, we weren't doing good randomised sampling, we were convenience sampling both in this study and in the previous study. There's a raft of possible causes. We know it's not Collie eye abnormality, hypertension, or progressive retinal atrophy. Okay, so we're not really 100% sure exactly what's causing it yet, and that's where more work is needed. So moving on now to police dogs, and this was the one study that I didn't actually have anything to do with. I'm happy to put anyone who's interested in contact with Andrew, who was the principal investigator, and you can of course have a look in the Journal of Animal Welfare for his publication if you want to know more. In terms of the police dogs, they began in New Zealand in 1956. At any one time there's about 115 dog handlers with their dogs, of which 90 to 95 of those are actually operational and the balance are being trained. And what Andrew did was sent out surveys to collect data on 182 dogs. So one handler may have got 2 surveys because they were going in for dogs at a point of time. Of those, 48 were still in service, 134 were no longer in service, 94 of them had been retired, and the balance had been euthanased, died in service or killed in service. Okay. So on the plus, you're seeing a large number of dogs retired and a number still in active service. If we have a look at the age of retirement, we can see that if the dogs retired, they generally were older than those that were euthanased, died or killed. Okay. So up to sort of 1.5 to 2 years younger. So why were they retired? The big reason is unable to meet the physical demands of the job. Okay, and there were also some behavioural problems and loss of tracking ability. And I'm not familiar with this data, so I can't tell you what the other was, but it would have been. I saw some elements of it, and it was just sort of things that maybe 1 or 2 dogs had, so it all got grouped together as other. Of that, 33 or 28% of the dogs were retired because they had back or spinal problems, and of that, a number of them involved the lumbar sacral joint. So a large percentage of those. So on the basis of this, the lumbar sacral joint is now, for the future research, is where Andrew is looking at management and various interventions that can help for the lumbar sacral joint. We are also funding work looking at various genes for diseases and whether or not they're present in guide dogs and in police dogs. We do have a little bit more work going on in leptospirosis. Big project that we started estimating energy expenditure in working dogs, in police dogs. And recently we've been approached by one of the veterinary practices in the South Island who are going to be doing a large-scale longitudinal study looking at farm working dogs and asking us to have some input into that. So there's a lot more happening in this space. Thank you for your time.